So next little prayer we can sing, you might have it there. It's called Refuge. And it's two things. The first two lines are expressing our reliance on the Buddha and his teachings. That's assuming we're a Buddhist already. If not, don't worry. And then the second two lines are really expressing this marvelous altruistic motivation or reason, if you like. I mean, the Tibetans say motivation. What's your motivation? We'd say, what's your goal? What's your purpose? Why are we here? So let's think. We're here to listen to these teachings, think about their meaning, make sense of it, and then practice. Why? Well, two things, really. I love this analogy. I use it a lot. You know, to develop the two wings of the bird. A bird needs two wings, wisdom and compassion. So compassion is the final point. But as His Holiness the Dalai Lama says, compassion is not enough. You've got to have wisdom. And that's the work you do in your mind. Yourself, to put you together, to make you a marvelous person. So you're qualified to help others. That's the idea. So I think we're here for this reason. Not just that, but in general, the long term, so we can become perfectly enlightened, so we can be a benefit to others. Thinking like that. And I'll sing a little prayer. You can sing with me in Tibetan. Sangye charang soke chognam la jangchu badu dagni kyap suchi dagi chernyen gi personam ki drola penchir sangye dropashok sangye charang soke chognam la jangchu badu dagni kyap suchi dagi chernyen gi personam ki drola penchir sangye dropashok Sangye charang soke chognam la jangcho badu dagni kyap suchi dagi chernyen gi personam ki drola penche sangye dropa shok. All right, people. So the basis of these teachings we're giving here, the basis is from Lama Yeshe, Lama Yeshe, who was my first teacher. I met him, Chen Raising Institute in Queensland, August, about 45, June 1976, that's 40, whatever that's 45 years, I think, 76, 86, 96, 106. Oh, it's 46 years now, gosh. So that's when I met him. And Lama Zopa was there too, and Lama Zopa was teaching a 1-month Lam Rim course, this very traditional, you know, introduction to this kind of the packaging of the path that's very traditional to Tibetans. And I remember 1 month I sat there. Part of me knew I'd found what I wanted, but I didn't have a clue what Lama Zopa was saying. I heard the words, but not the meaning. I kept saying to myself, where's the Buddhism? I love this bizarre kind of history and things and preliminary practices and all these words I did not comprehend. Couldn't get my head around it, which is very typical because it's a whole nother way of seeing the world. You know, you don't get any kind of Western introduction to it. You just jump in the deep end of the Tibetan way of saying it. And you've got to either leave or you squeeze your brain and try to make sense of it, you know. But when Lama Yeshe would come along in the evening and give a talk, I would sigh with relief. I'd think, oh, thank God, this makes sense, you know. This, because Lama Yeshe, what he'd do is speak experientially. I mean, very traditionally, there's two ways of teaching, you know. You'd get the text and you'd give a commentary on it. Or if you're a yogi like Lama Yeshe, like an actual practitioner like Lama Yeshe, or both Lamas Zopa too, you'd speak experientially from your own knowledge and your own experience according to the needs of the person right in front of you. It's like you can intuit where they're at. And that was Lama Yeshe's incredible skill. I can't tell you how astonishing. Every time I read his transcripts, every time I try to edit his teachings, because I happen to edit this book, Mahamudra, it just blows my mind how extraordinarily skillful he was. I mean, he met Western people, I mean, foreigners, and happened to be Western people, Americans and Australians and Europeans mostly. I think in 1960, the very first student was well, she was Eastern European. She was, I think, some Ukrainian or Latvian or something, kind of aristocrats. But Lama Yeshe liked to call her a Russian princess. Sounded more dramatic, you know. They always referred to Zena as a Russian princess. She was neither a princess nor Russian, but it's okay. She was that part of the world, you know. So she lived in America for ages, and she was their first student. She met them in 1965 in Darjeeling, because Lama Zopa and Lama Yeshe both met in when they came out into exile. Lama Zopa was a Sherpa actually, and when he was recognized as a little boy, when he was about 6 or something, or 7, as a reincarnated Lama. This tradition, he behaved unusually, and would say that he would, when he played games, the little boy, he made mud pie dorjies and mud pie bells, and he would announce he's doing a puja, and then list all these people coming to the puja, who he'd say were his benefactors, and they were all the last life benefactors of the previous yogi. So anyway, it seemed to dawn on them that he maybe was somebody specially indicated, he had some kind of memory, So they checked with the local Lama, and he announced, yes, it would seem he is the reincarnation of this Lama who is known as the Laudo Lama. There was this hole in the wall that used to store radishes or onions, I never know which. Laudo means that. And then when this previous Lama, Kunsang Yeshe, this old Nyingma lay Lama, he decided to go into a meditation retreat, which is not uncommon when they got older. And he pulled the radishes out and moved in, basically. And he said that Guru Rinpoche gave him this cave. So he spent his last 20 years in this cave, and then he passed away. And then Lama Zopa seemed to show indicate that he was a reincarnation. And when he was very tiny, as soon as the mummy would turn her back, little Zopa's gone, this little bare bottom, and they'd find him crawling up the hill to where they knew that the cave was from the previous Lama. And every time when he started to talk, he'd be gone. They'd find him and, come home. He'd say, no, that is my home. He'd point up to the cave. So he'd behave in this unusual way. And so they found the local Lama checked up and said, yes, it would seem it's the reincarnation of the Laudo Lama. So when he was about 12, I think, or 11, his parents, which is not uncommon, decided to walk to Tibet and go on pilgrimage. This is Bobby in 58 or something. So they dropped him off at this Gelugpa monastery just over the border in Tibet to be taken care of. So then when the 59 business happened, he was in Tibet, so he had to escape. So someone helped him get to Bhutan, and then he was taken. He was 13 or 12 at the time. Yeah. So he was then taken to this place in Buxa, which is in northern India, where all the Tibetans were then housed, the Lama, all the monks were housed, and he lived there, and that's when he met Lama Yeshe, who was 10 years older, and Lama had escaped from Tibet, and so he became kind of, Lama Yeshe sort of took control of him, took care of him, like his mummy and his daddy, So then in about 64 or something, Lama Zopa got TB, which is really common, still common for the Tibetans who come down to these plains, So he took him to Darjeeling to try and recuperate. And that's where they met this Zina woman. And by that point, already Lama Zopa Lama Yeshe had some kind of English. Lama Zopa just knew he had to learn to speak English. And so when he was very little, when he had escaped, he'd be sitting on his bed and he would memorize, because that's how you learn things in the monasteries, you memorize. So he memorized Time magazine. He'd read stories and memorize them. And he'd try to memorize the dictionary, That's how they learn things. So anyway, Lama Yeshe started to learn, because they somehow intuited their future disciples, mostly English speakers, So then in Darjeeling, they met this woman and started giving her classes. And then they moved to Kathmandu, circuitous route, and got to Kathmandu by 67, 68. And that seemed to coincide. It did coincide with all the influx of Western hippies looking for drugs and enlightenment simultaneously. I don't know what it makes us think that drugs has got to do with enlightenment. I mean, talk about wacky, So maybe because they saw these Tibetan men who wore earrings and long hair, they thought, oh, they must be hippies as well. But actually, if you had Tibetans dressed like we do, they'd all be in their shirts and ties, and the ladies would be their high heels and their handbags and their gloves. They're really conservative people, they're not hippies at all. Anyway, that's then when they started meeting all these hippies, in Kathmandu. Why am I telling you this? Yeah, anyway, so then I met them in 1976, like I said. That was about 8 years later. And after Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa first came to the West, they came first 74, then again 75, then again 76 when I met them. And I think they came to New Zealand then at the same time, I think. 76 or 77, I can't remember. Same time. Anyway, that's when I met them. And here I am all these years later. But the skill that Lama had was really quite astonishing. I didn't appreciate it then, but the more you study Tibetan Buddhism and read the texts and listen to the traditional teachings, it's straight out of medieval days. It's like untouched, that was the good side about Tibet. It was so isolated. Everything kept intact, it wasn't polluted. It wasn't watered down. But I know when you first heard, you hear traditional Tibetan Lamas teaching, it's like they talk exactly the same in the medieval days, which is why it's so hard to really hear it for us. I mean, I sat there for that 1 month, really can't get my head around what Rinpoche was talking about, you know. And I felt back then, even, it was just true, it was seen to be coming into the West. Western people seem to like Buddhism. That it's kind of like our job, you know, to be this bridge, isn't it? Has to be. But Lama Yeshe had this ability, and it's really quite astonishing because it was just intuitive. He didn't meet any other Westerns. He had one student. Maybe he'd met some on the way. And the only way to understand, this is where we're getting to Mahamudra now, the only way to understand why he was so instinctively wise, he knew the language to use, he knew the way to talk to these modern people. And it's mysterious to us, but when we understand, this is now the point, when we understand the Buddhist view of the mind, I think we really still, unless we really look at it and study it and contemplate and practice it, we don't realize how extraordinary Buddhism is in relation to the nature, to understanding the nature of mind. It's not what we think in the West. It's only really since the Dalai Lama, the last 20, 30 years, more maybe, has been having all these meetings and conferences with the best brains in the West, the neuroscientists and all the, you know, that they're now beginning to appreciate the incredible knowledge, not just about the mind, but about the universe, right back in India. And not even the Buddha, but before the Buddha. I mean, as Holiness the Dalai Lama says, it was these amazing Indians more than 3,000 years ago who are the ones who began the investigation into the nature of self. I mean, if some of us are white, maybe some of us are white, perhaps we're English and background, you know, whatever. We really probably thought it was Mr. Freud 100 years ago was the clever one, you know. I mean, people were talking 3,000 years. And when you get past the language and the Indian kind of concepts and the language, then you start to realize how absolutely astonishing these genius Indian yogis and scholars and philosophers and thinkers, their views of the universe, their views of reality are absolutely astonishing. But we're so arrogant. We don't think so. We just, oh, we invented everything, you know. So it's really only now that people begin to realize this with all the translation of these texts and getting past the cultural barriers. And the expertise of Buddha is the mind, not, you know, it's the mind, the way mind works. And this is the subject we're discussing in this retreat. I mean, these genius Indians, well before the Buddha, invented this technique that's known in Sanskrit as shamatha, in English as calm abiding, or in Tibetan as shine. And it's the name given to this psychological skill, which is what meditation is, do not doubt that. A psychological skill in genius. There is nothing equivalent, even remotely, with respect, in the Western religious philosophies and in science. There's nothing remotely like it. This brilliant technique invented by these genius Indians well before the Buddha that enables a person to get this totally powerful control over the mind, concentration, samadhi, to a level of subtlety that's absolutely not posited as even existing in the neuroscientific psychological models of the mind. So it's very simple. And there's no equivalent. And why you need this, and Lama talks about this, why you need this state of mind, why you need to accomplish this skill, which is where you access this subtler level of your mind, your subtler level of cognition that is beyond sensory, beyond conceptual, beyond any brain activity. If you were to see a person who'd fully developed this samadhi, they would look like they're dead. We need to access that subtle level of the mind. I like to call it the microscope of our mind, because that level of mind is the only level of mind that's capable of deconstructing and unpacking and unraveling and removing from the mind all the neuroses and delusions, which is what is in the Four Noble Truths, Buddha's analysis of what is suffering and what its causes are, so that you can finally see nakedly, directly, the way things exist. Of course, the word for that is to realize emptiness. We're going to be discussing this because Mahamudra is all about this. invented by these Indians 3,000 years ago. Only now clever scientific people getting a little bit humble and recognizing this extraordinary knowledge, you know. So when Buddha diverged in his own direction, you know, like 500 years later, whatever, having been through that extraordinary system, knew he couldn't get any further, felt they hadn't gone far enough, specifically in relation to the ultimate nature of the self. And that's where he diverged in his own direction. And of course, he didn't chuck out all the things he'd learned. He didn't throw out, you know, the views that he got from these genius Indians. He would suggest he moved forward. He moved on and added extra knowledge. That's what he would say. And took these techniques with him. There's a living extant technique now, right till today. And the world, what it knows vaguely as mindfulness, is based upon this technique. So what I'm getting at now, if you can understand this wisdom that these genius beings, yogis and yoginis, have from having access to their own mind, and this is the point of it, concentration itself is not even Dharma, actually. Concentration itself is as a tool you use in relation to Dharma. So it becomes then a Dharma activity. In general, mindfulness, concentration, these are not in their nature virtuous actions. We're going to discuss all this. It's crucial to understand what it means. But again, we have all these misconceptions. I mean, the number of definitions of mindfulness on the planet is embarrassing. We're going to discuss all this, okay? So when you realize the level of knowledge you can get and the level of ability you have once you've got this concentrated level of mind to do the actual job of deconstructing and unpacking and unraveling and identifying and becoming intimately, super clearly familiar with the contents of your crazy mind. That's the only reason you need it. Because why is because Buddha, in the Four Noble Truths, his first teaching. First one is there is suffering, folks, and there are 3 levels. We'll go into this. Second, there are causes. And as far as Buddha is concerned, there are 2 main causes of suffering. This is so insane, it's like a joke. There are 2 main causes of suffering. One is past karma, we're going to go into this, and one is delusion, the neuroses in the mind, which is a very specific Buddhist approach, and we're going to discuss. We have to. 2 main causes. And then the third one is, you know what? There is a state that's called the cessation of suffering and its causes. That's what nirvana means, or some place like heaven. And fourth is how to do it. Very practical. So Buddha has found, this is his unique point, and this is shocking in the West, neuroscientifically, psychologically, a shocking, absurd concept. The Buddha has found, very simply, from his own direct experience, that what he refers to as the neuroses or the afflictions or the delusions, and in Lama Yeshe's one of his, in Mahamudra, in the preface, I identified 21 different terms that Lama used as equivalents of this word that's typical in the Sanskrit and Pali scriptures, and the one that's translated into Tibetan, and the one that's in English, and the word is affliction. Somehow Lama Yeshe knew intuitively, way back then, that it was a dumb word in English. We don't use it. Oh, I have an affliction today. Very Victorian, even Middle Ages, isn't it? We just don't use that word. But that's the term, that's the translation of Buddha's word. So we need to understand what he means by that. One of the words used as an equivalent is the word delusion, and that needs understanding. We'll go into this. So Buddha has found from his own direct experience, he's not a creator, he didn't make this up, it's not just faith. He's found from his own direct experience, from the depth of his own subtlety of mind using this shamatha technique, that you can finally rid your mind of all neuroses. That's a good term. Buddha would have liked that word for afflictions. The voices of ego, basically. He has found that these states of mind are adventitious, which implies that they are not at the core of our being. I remember one woman in a class, you know, she burst into laughter, and it's really appropriate. She said, don't be ridiculous. You can get rid of all anger, all attachment, all jealousy. You'd be mentally ill, she said. And why? Is because in our models and in the neuroscientific model for sure, there is no view that says you locate that piece of brain and you cut it out. We tried that in the 1930s. It was called a lobotomy. And we discovered that you turn people into veggies. Doesn't work. So there's no view in modern psychology. There's no view in neuroscience that gives you methods to rid the mind utterly of these things. It just would be bizarre. Because why? Because in all our systems, it's a given that a normal person, right, has some anger, some attachment, some jealousy, some love, some compassion, some wisdom, hopefully more of the good stuff. But there's no view that says you can rid the mind utterly of that other stuff. That's what Buddha's telling us. I mean, we say the words, oh yeah, Buddha says this, blah, 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 you know, we're not hearing what we're saying. It's mind-boggling what he's saying. It's shocking what he's saying. So clearly, if we're going to take him seriously, that every single person is the Four Noble Truths, every person has the potential naturally to rid the mind of all the rubbish and develop all the goodness. If we want to take that as our hypothesis, because you can't just believe it, then we've got some work to do. I mean, actually, in the Mahayana, the word Buddha, the etymology of the word Buddha is very tasty. Buddha implies the utter eradication, this point I just made, the utter eradication from the mind of all the neuroses. And Da implies the development to perfection of everything else. Love, compassion, wisdom, etc., etc. That Buddha has found that these are at the core of our being and the others are not. So this is the essence of all Buddhist practice. So if that's the end result, if you're on the Mahayana path, you know, so you've achieved your own nirvana, plus you add bodhicitta to the mix, and you become a Buddha. If that's the end result, then it's really evident. It tells you immediately your job. If it is possible to remove the delusions and develop the goodness to perfection, it's obvious your job is to distinguish between the delusions and the virtues. And that's the job. It starts now. That's the job of being a Buddhist. That actually is the job of being a Buddhist. That's the way to define what a Buddhist actually is. You're not a Buddhist by wearing these 14th century Tibetan robes. You're not a Buddhist if you shave your head. Technically, you're not a Buddhist if you say mantra, do prostrations, do water bowls, all this business, mindful, meditate. No, Shamatha's Hindu. Not being rude, it's not Buddhist. The Buddha took it, you know. So that's not what defines you as a Buddhist. What defines you as a Buddhist, when you start the job of identifying in your mind a delusion and distinguishing it from a virtue, and then doing the job. That's the job of being a Buddhist. That's the job. And then to lessen the delusions and eventually get rid of them, finally when you realize emptiness, that's what Mahamudra is all about. And to grow the goodness to perfection. That's it. And therefore everything in Buddhism, if it is valid, whether it's a mantra offering, a prostration offering, 10-pin bowling, you know, that's how it looks to me always when I look at that universe. Seeing weird dudes with strange hats on, look, these pictures and big green ladies. Any of this, if it is valid, if it's valid, it has to be a technique that you use to help you do the job of lessening delusions and growing goodness. That's it. And if it's not, it's a load of rubbish, chuck it out. And that's not being silly, it's a fact. If there's a single word, phrase, method, technique, philosophy, whatever in Buddhism that isn't helping you do the job of lessening delusion and growing goodness, it is not a valid Buddhist technique. It's very simple. So we need to have that kind of rigor, not just blindly swallow things whole, you know. Or if you do hear about a technique, and that's very common, the commonest thing with people who become Tibetan Buddhist, or who look at Tibetan Buddhism completely confused, all this ritual, they say. The first thing they say, all this ritual. And it's true. But then you've got to analyze what a ritual is. It's really important. You don't just chuck it out. A ritual is what you do with your body and your speech. It's the way people behave. So you go to Tibet, Tibetans behave very differently. If you meet a Tibetan who's never met a Western person, and you poke your hand out and say, hello, Tenzin. He looks at you, what you poking your hand at me for? He's never heard of a handshake. You understand? They bonk heads instead, like the Maoris, like you New Zealanders, you know. He's never heard. So what's it? That's a ritual, isn't it? But because you give meaning to the ritual and then you take it for granted, and then because you see a Tibetan bonk heads, oh, they're weird, you know. Just means because we're narrow-minded. Rituals is what you do with your body and speech. If there's no meaning to it, then I agree, you're completely idiotic to do something that has no meaning. That's incredible. That's ridiculous. What are you poking your hand out for? I don't know. That's stupid. That's idiocy. So of course, Tibetan's another language. Thai is a language. You know, there's a whole culture. Japan, you know, where the Buddhism was in these countries. So you have to unpack it, unravel it, understand it, make common sense of it, you know. So it's all about the mind. So what Mahamudra is a deceptively simple technique, meditation technique, direct experiential technique that can help you realize the ultimate nature of your mind, its emptiness. So on the face of it, it's simple. It's technically very simple, which of course fools people. So as Lama says in the book, he uses the Panchen Lama, the 17th century Panchen Lamas. It's very simple text. This technique was kept secret, was passed on just student to disciple to disciple to teacher, you know. And then the first time it was written about was by Panchen Lama, this text that is used as the basis for Lama's book. And Lama actually taught this in Australia, in at Atisha Centre, 2 hours north of Melbourne. And this was in 1982. I forget, even though I wrote the preface, I can't remember. 82, I think. 82, I think. He wrote it. And then 1 year later, Lama had invited His Holiness, or maybe the other way around, to teach to a whole bunch of Westerners in India and Nepal, India. And Lama asked him to give a commentary on this text. So he did give it, and that's been published since in a book that's been edited and translated by Alex Berzin. So you might like to get it. It's a very wonderful book. It's called the Kagyu Gelug. There's a different translation in here, but he translates it the Kagyu Gelug Mahamudra or something like that. And it's a commentary, this commentary that His Holiness gave after the teaching Lama gave in Australia on this text. But Lama gave it in Atisha Centre when it was one of the first main teachings in this little church, because Ian Green, who started the centre, his family owned this 100 acres of land 2 hours north of Melbourne, and they ran a mock gold rush, whatever you call it, village, you know, called Sandhurst Town. People would come visit, tourists would come. So then the parents offered Ian 50 acres, and that's now Atisha Centre. There's a monastery there. And also there's this, if you've heard of this replica of the Gyantse Stupa, this amazing stupa in Tibet being built there, you know, extraordinary thing now. So Lama taught this there to about 70 Westerners. I wasn't there. Let me see if I can find the book. I hope some of you've got it. You can get it, download it digitally. It's really worth it. It's a little book, just a little book. And like I mentioned briefly yesterday, and I think I'm a bit naughty doing this, but traditionally when it's taught, you're supposed to do it in the framework of giving a highest yoga tantra empowerment. So Lama did that. It was the first time I think he had the highest yoga empowerment initiation in Australia. It was Haruka Chakrasambhava. But you have to try and think I'm just kind of sharing a little bit of Lama's words with you. It's not a really serious. I mean, I'm not a yogi or a yogini. I'm not a non-binary one either. I don't want the non-binary term for a yogi or a yogini. We have to make all these new language now, don't we? So I think I'm a non-binary. I'm never sure if I'm a girl or a boy. That's non-binary, isn't it? You don't know with neither, right? That's about me. I look like a girl. Well, no, people see me from head up. They all think I'm a boy. Then they get embarrassed and they discover my chest, you know. Then they don't know what to say. So I've got the equipment of a girl, but I feel like a non-binary, especially when you get older. I don't know if somebody else feels that way. Yes, it's interesting, isn't it? You don't worry about sex anymore. Then I think that's what it is. Your craving for sex goes. You become a person. You stop being a girl or a boy. You become a person. That's what I think. I don't know if that was politically correct or not. I'm not sure. Let me find this book. So, okay. So yeah, we won't do traditional form, because I mean, when you give this teaching, there's Sutra Mahamudra and there's Tantric Mahamudra. And that Lama Yeshe just spent like 10 minutes giving a very brief overview of Tantric Mahamudra at the teaching, but his main emphasis was on the Sutra teaching. This technique, okay? So basically, what it is a technique, it's the two modes of meditation. It's the two modes of meditation that are taught in Buddhism, shamatha and what's the other one called in Vipassana? That's right, shamatha and Vipassana. There's two modes of meditation taught in Buddhism. That's it. Millions of techniques, but two main modes of meditation. This is across the board, and this is not a Mahayana. These are not Mahayana techniques. This is what's shared with all the teachings that you'd have in Burma or Thailand, you know, and the techniques that you need to achieve your own nirvana, which is what the basis of the Four Noble Truths is. It's not about bodhicitta. It's not the Mahayana. It's all the teachings of the first stages of practice, the achievement. So if you look at the Tibetan packaging of teachings, we all know is called the Lam Rim. You know, the first and second scopes of teachings. That's the teachings shared with the Theravada path, basically. The teachings that Lord Buddha gave that enables you to finally achieve your own liberation. And then if you're on the Mahayana path, you then go to the next scope, the middle great scope, and that's where you learn, that's where you get bodhicitta, and add that to the mix. So this technique is combining these two modes of meditation, but in a very specific way. It's quite unique. So let's look at, even just in general, look at these meditation techniques. Let's get them wrapped down on the earth, because there's lots of confusion when we say the word even meditation in Buddhism. People get so confused. So first of all, Buddha didn't invent meditation. It's just a general word, but it's used differently in different, you know, traditions. If you spoke to a Christian and they do meditation, it's going to be completely different. But there's this kind of, the general idea when we think about mindfulness, there's this general, I mean, a lot of misconceptions, I would suggest. So basically there's two modes of meditation, the end, and they're named in terms of their end result. So the first one, which is basically a Hindu technique, like I said, Buddha took it with him when he diverged in his own direction. It's called, in Sanskrit, the end result, and then the technique is known in terms of the end result, is known as shamatha. In English, it's calm abiding. One of the translations is calm abiding. Thank you, darling. So then, and then the other one, thanks, sweetheart, so kind. I think I'm plugged in. Let's see. There it is. Good, okay. So then the other one is known as Vipassana, which is insight. Insight. So again, enormous confusion about that. So Buddha taught in terms of insight. So concentrate, the first one is a technique to cultivate concentration. The word in Tibet, in Sanskrit, samadhi, is concentration, but it's referring to a really subtle level of concentration. And shamatha is one of those examples of this of samadhi. It's a subtle level of concentration. So subtle meaning, as I've been indicating, utilizing levels of cognition, levels of your consciousness, levels of your mind that are necessarily beyond sensory, beyond the conceptual, and not linked at all to the brain. Which, of course, why anybody who hears that, if you're a philosophical materialist, you'll just laugh in cynicism, because it doesn't exist. It's a load of rubbish, you know. So shamatha is this technique that these genius Indians invented that enable you to get to the subtle level of your mind, and why you want it. Because it does this, the mind at that level is so, I don't think we can conceptualize and even imagine, because there's nothing equivalent in our culture. We can't even imagine the skill and brilliance of the mind at this level. It's inconceivable. That's why it's so important to remember, you know. I mean, one of the chapters in here, I'll read it to you. Lama, and they often don't do this, he talked about the qualities that you would accomplish, some of them. There's nothing equivalent in our culture. So there's nothing equivalent. Where, you know, there's just nothing remotely like it. But we need to access this subtle level of mind to do the job of unpacking and unraveling and eventually seeing reality. And this kind of sounds so cosmic to us because we don't talk in these terms in our psychology. And this is the trouble too, because we call this spiritual. So we put it in some kind of weird basket, you know, but it's the mind, people. Don't distinguish. Spiritual is psychological for the Buddha, just subtler levels, that's all. So we need to accomplish, and as Lama says in the book, it is impossible to realize the ultimate nature of things, emptiness, without having accessed this subtle level of mind. It's like, for me, I best to call it, it's like the microscope of the mind. You know, you can't possibly see an atom with your naked eye. Well, you can't possibly see the subtle things like emptiness with conceptuality. Not possible. But because it's not existing in our culture, you've got to really comprehend it and not mystify it, you know. So, okay, what is it says concentration. We'll describe the stages. I'll read from the Lam Rim too. The different stages of subtlety you go through. This accomplishment of this technique is described in terms of 9 stages, you know, 9 stages of the mind getting ever more subtle, ever more subtle, ever more subtle. And then the purpose of it is you use it to then get insight. You use it to get vipassana. Now, this is confusing to us as well because Lord Buddha taught many different vipassana techniques. And one of the first ones he taught, on the basis of getting some concentration in the first mode of meditation, you now go to the second, and one of them is, and I mean, I've never done this, it's taught especially in the Theravadan tradition. I think it's called, you use this concentration to scan the sensations of your body. So I think one of the common misconceptions in the West is the Buddha wants us to get insight into the body. No, he couldn't care less about the body. He's using this ability to first concentrate in the first mode, then you go to the second mode and you use the concentration to the degree that you've got it to scan the sensations of the body in order to get insight into impermanence. Not insight into the body, because we're so addicted to our bodies, you know. It's just an example. It's one of his many, many vipassana techniques that he taught to enable us to get insight, vipassana, into impermanence. There are many. So the one taught here is from the Mahayana point of view, and it's insight into emptiness. It's more subtle. Nothing to do with the body at all. Insight, and so it's called special insight. And that's what we all need. Whether you're on the Mahayana path, the Theravadan path, whatever, we need to cut the root of all delusions. To get out of samsara, all these words, to achieve our nirvana, these are all the words, you know. But here in Mahamudra, they're used differently, and that's what we're going to get into. They're used differently. So first of all, in the first mode, the traditional, okay, to do concentration meditation, you need to focus on something. Lama in here he talks about how one of the ways of describing the mind is in terms of its being a mirror. Or another way they talk is always the mind is the subject and it always has an object. In other words, mind can't exist in isolation. Mind, okay, the word mind and consciousness are used synonymously. Okay, and they're referring to our capacity for cognition. That's what they mean by mind or consciousness. It's the capacity for cognition. The definition of mind. A definition has 2 parts. The first part tells you it's conventional, something's conventional characteristic. And the second part tells you its job. What does it do? So like, for example, what's that, mummy? Well, darling, it's called a thermos. This is going to get us into emptiness later when we'll discuss. You need to, you know, because Buddha's telling us we're misconceiving everything. So the first thing you have to do is establish what something is conventionally, and then you can look into how it exists ultimately. So the first thing is you have to label something, thermos. Mummy, what's a thermos? And she will give me a definition. The first part of it tells you its conventional characteristics. Well, it's this flat-bottomed metal container. You can see, darling, she'll say. And I can. But what's the other part is the most important. But mummy, what does it do? What is it? What's its meaning? That's the second part. And that tells you it keeps my tea warm. Now you know what a thermos is conventionally. So what's the definition of mind? First one is tells you its conventional characteristics. And this is where you hear it's clear. meaning not physical. That's the meaning. Or sometimes I would say luminous, which gets us all very trippy hippie, you know. It means it's not physical. And this is where it's difficult for modern psychological people, because by definition, mind is equivalent to the word brain. So to hear that consciousness is not physical is a pretty abstract concept. So this reminds me, when I was working on Lama Rinpoche's book, How to Face Death Without Fear, highly recommend. It's an amazing handbook, you know. So in there, when I was editing that book, I also read, at the time, I read this book by an American medical journalist whose expertise was death. He's a very funny fellow. He was an atheist and a very funny man, Nick Teresi. And the book is called The Undead. It's not about zombies. He's hilariously funny. And it was all his research on the complications and problems that are now existing in the medical profession as a result of the donating organs business. I can't think of the right words for it. Because suddenly now they're finding more and more. There's always been evidence of centuries and centuries of people coming back to life. But for the materialists, it's too hard. So they put it in the too hard basket. But now it's becoming a major problem when a damn person whose liver you want to cut out comes back to life, you know? When they look like they're brain dead, they come back to life. How inconvenient. So they're forced to now have to look at it. Do you understand? So a lot of things, and he was quite cynical about the business, I'm afraid. I mean, we all sisters all talked about whether Jan have any organs, but because she had lupus and she was so sick, they didn't want any of her organs, and I was glad in a way. Anyway, this fellow is very funny and a lot of research about the problems and contradictions now, because people are now are confused about when death is on the basis of there's one of coming back to life and other types of things. He had a whole chapter on out-of-body experiences during people's operations. He says himself he's an atheist. He has no views. He just reports. He's a very good journalist. So that was very fascinating. I mean, when you look at the Vajrayana, the esoteric Mahayana Buddhist teachings, and their analysis of what death is, and it's described in terms of 8 stages, right, of gradual deconstruction of the person. So you've got, in relation to that one, you've got gross consciousness, which is sensory and conceptual. No, sensory mostly, and you've got gross body. So our sensory consciousness is clearly connected to this gross body, isn't it? I mean, you can't have eye consciousness without an eyeball. You can't have tactile consciousness without, the nerves and the skin and so on and so forth. So you've got gross consciousness and then gross body. And that gradually ceases as in the first 4 stages of death. The ears stop, the eyes stop, the earth element, the water element. This is the model they use, right? So by the time you stop breathing, this is the whole business about my sister Jan. My sisters were all a bit cynical about it, but they were kind of kind to me, let me have my silly ideas. When she stopped breathing, that's the gross consciousness ceasing. But subtle consciousness, which is also, if you're thinking of dreams, sleep, by the way, the sleep process is exactly the same as this death process. It's just not as dramatic. I mean, you know very well when you go to sleep, your senses have stopped. You know that. Someone can touch you, you don't feel. Someone can open your eyelid, you can't see. It's the same as my sister Janet. She was gross level had ceased, right? But there's no saying, you can't say until you can't be sure, but a subtle mind, and that's more your mental states. And that goes through another 4 stages of gradual deconstruction until you get to the very subtle consciousness, which they call the clear light mind. Of course, that's not posited in the West at all, as we know. And that's where that's the basis of a lot of discussions that His Holiness the Dalai Lama is having with a lot of the scientists who are interested in all this, They created, these scientists have created machines that they put on, like His Holiness offers up one of his yogis who's in meditation, technically dead, but meditating at the subtle level, and they stick wires on to try and see if they can find any indication of life, So this is interest in people. So good that people are questioning their assumptions, So that anyway, this one chapter, so you've got gross conscious, subtle conscious, and very subtle. When you stop breathing, that's when we think death is. But you've got the subtle still, and that can be there up to 3 days. And there are certain indications that I was trying to check with my sister, whether I could see. They say, because the whole way they describe it, the different chakras and the channels, this is from the Vajrayana, which is very similar to the Chinese one. And also this is the basis of the Tibetan medical system. As the energies get, the wind energy in the mind gets more and more subtle, goes into the central channel, and everything then finally gathers at the heart chakra. And so when you put your hand there and it's distinctly warm, that means the mind is still there. But I couldn't tell with Jan. I couldn't tell. I just couldn't tell. It's interesting. It's hard to tell. Anyway, whatever. So in this book, this fellow had a whole chapter reporting people's experiences of being conscious during their operation. So in other words, they've been totally anesthetized, which means they're unconscious, like asleep, like dead. The gross consciousness has completely ceased, but they're totally aware. So of course, most of the time, as he said, medical profession people are cynical. Nah, it's just rubbish. Someone told them something. It's not possible. Not possible. But he joked about this one woman who had to have such a radical procedure that they had to stop all her organs working. And from their point of view, there was no way on the planet she could be conscious of anything, but she reported the most vivid out-of-body experience. So all he can do is report. You know, he was jokes about it. So this is what's called subtle consciousness. And that's what these meditators are able to accomplish. They access their subtle consciousness. And there's no brain activity there. And that's where, so one doctor who's in this business, he said, I can now say with certainty that consciousness is not a function of the brain. I don't know what it is, but that much I can say. So I think it's brilliant that people are questioning their assumptions now, you know. I think it's wonderful. So anyway, why am I getting at here? Because concentration, when you got samadhi, you've gone to the subtle level of mind. And you can't see any evidence of it in the brain. So the way I like to say it, without trying to insult neuroscientists, if one of you is a neuroscientist, is that the brain is a physical indicator of what's in the mind, but it's not the mind itself. And that's the one you've got to get just to hear these teachings and the possibility of going to these subtle levels. You have to posit that possibility, you know. Because it's not possible for the Buddha's view for a brain to be consciousness. Is literally impossible. Consciousness by definition for the Buddha. This is one of the fundamental points you've got to try and understand and take it as your working hypothesis. Otherwise, Buddhism does not make sense. That mind or consciousness by definition is not physical. And that's where, of course, people then, oh, that's religion, you know. So, of course, the Christians will say the non-physical component is called a soul. Buddha does not talk about a soul. He only talks about mind. But he happens to posit subtler levels of mind, that's all. The sensory, the conceptual, and these subtler levels of mind that don't depend upon a brain and cannot be seen in the brain. They can't be indicated by the brain, you know, because it's subtler. That's the fundamental point to get clear. And that's the basis of the Hindu teachings as well. This whole accomplishment of samadhi is positing this subtler level of consciousness. But we're so used to sort of mystifying that because we can't describe it in neuroscientific terms. So it's kind of mystical. No, not mystical at all. It's knowable and doable by anybody. So it'll be our turn next. That's the main learning. That's the one. The Lamas all say until you realize impermanence, until you realize energetically that you're going to die, you don't really want to practice. You don't really begin because the craving at permanent me is so primordial inside us, you know. The assumption of life that I'll have it tomorrow and the next day and the next month, you know. So really, it's a wake-up call. That's the wake-up call. Of course, there's other people who die. When it comes to family, it gets a bit close. But still, we have to remember, that'll be me. That'll be me. Hopefully not falling down the stairs in blood everywhere. Hopefully quiet death. That's the one learning. Okay, so let's just look at these teachings in the framework of this typical Tibetan packaging. All the Tibetans have their own various ways of packaging Buddha's teachings. So we are here talking from the perspective of Lama Tsongkhapa, our 14th century lineage Lama, which is the tradition of the center, which is the tradition of Lama Zopa, Lama Yeshe. And so, as we know, this gradual path, as it's called, literally, Lam Rim technically means gradual path, stages of the path. So, you know, it's a nice way of saying, really, the word, I think, the English word course. If you say you're doing a course, a music course, let's say 5 years, math, cooking, anything, we wouldn't say we're doing a gradual path. It's a Tibetan concept, isn't it? But it is a gradual path, isn't it? It's just not the term we use. Oh, I'm doing a gradual path of music. You could say that if we started using that term, because you know perfectly well, you start earlier stages, grade 1. Then you get a bit more advanced. Then you get to the advanced stages. So you go in a gradual path. It's literally true. You just have to think of it that way. So what this is a course. And what are you studying? What are you becoming? What's the goal? What are you going to end result? What are you going to graduate as? Not a cook, you know, not a mathematician, a Buddha. It's exactly like that. Not complicated. So, you know, as we know, this divides into 3 different, what they call scopes. I mean, actually, Rinpoche, Lama Zopa, you know, respecting the lineage, would say the first level of the teachings are the teachings and practices suitable to the disciple of the least capability. Sometimes we call that the lowest scope, which says technically that's not correct. It's the teachings that are suitable to that scope of mind, within that scope, you know. So, I mean, I use the term junior school. It's really cliched, but as soon as you say that, we understand. It's a concept we understand. You're in junior school music, you know, it's the earliest stages. Then you get a bit further, you get to high school, the middle scope. Then you get to the really advanced, you know, what we're going to call that? Well, I call that university. Why not? So then, of course, in the Mahayana, you've got the Vajrayana, and that's postgraduate. I mean, it's a really helpful concept because it forces us to realize it is gradual. But even when we say gradual, when I first heard this first teaching from Lama Zopa, and it was called the Lam Rim, and he's giving these teachers in a gradual way, I had no idea what he's talking about. What do you mean gradual? I didn't understand, you know. So it takes us a while because the more we study it and think about it, internalize it, to then see the psychological stages of development. Because here, what's the gradual path is your mind developing from the most basic level to more advanced to the most advanced. It's your mind. This path is not external. It's a psychological path, you know. Of course it is. So all the teachings in this Lam Rim these are the teachings of the sutras. Then you've got the final stages, which I call postgraduate. That's the Vajrayana. That's so-called Tantra, the different Tantras. These 2 words are used either to refer to a level of a teaching or to a text. So you've got the Tantric teachings, which are the Vajrayana, the more advanced esoteric teachings, which were really only kept extant in Tibet. They all came from India, of course. And some of these teachings don't even exist in certain cultures. Like if you go to Burma, you're not going to hear about the Vajrayana. If you go to Burma, you'll know about bodhicitta. Bodhicitta is a Buddha's teaching, but the Theravadan teaching in general would suggest that most people can achieve their nirvana. All people can achieve their own nirvana, but some people might choose to become a Buddha. That's not necessarily the main goal. Whereas if you look at the Mahayana approach, that's the goal, to become a Buddha. Everyone has got that potential. But if you're in Japan, you'll hear the same, because it's Mahayana. But the Vajrayana is only really extant in Tibet. When Dharma started going to the different countries, 4th century was China, then Japan, then Thailand and Burma. And it was all the sutra teachings, just the sutra teachings. Japan, China, Taiwan is the Mahayana as well. And then finally, it was only in Tibet where the Tantric yogis went. So the Tantric teachings. And in the beginning, of course, when people heard about these teachings back before the Dalai Lama came into the world, there was a lot of cynicism about it. It's like this weird made-up Tibetan rubbish, you know. Since the Dalai Lama's been in the world, people begin to really comprehend that he's a valid scholar and is a valid Buddhist, and he's kind of made things more public, you know, more. It's very interesting. So anyway, the Lam Rim, this packaging coming from the Tibetans, includes everything you'd learn if you're on the Theravadan path, which is junior school and high school. It's not being rude. Then if you graduated at high school, you'd achieve your own nirvana. You'd achieve your own liberation from suffering and its causes. So you do the first stages, which is abide by the laws of karma. You discipline your body and speech. You live in vows. And then you get to the next level, next scope, high school. You then look into your mind. You get renunciation. You give up attachment. And then you get shamatha. Then you'd realize emptiness. And a couple of lifetimes later, you'd finally achieve your nirvana in that lifetime. And then when you die, you don't come back. You're gone. You've disappeared into a puff of smoke. If you're on the Mahayana path, you will consciously come back, even if you don't need to, because you've got this business of bodhicitta. You decide you want to become a Buddha so you can manifest as many bodies to help sentient beings. There's very many different teachings in Buddhism. You know, they're all valid. So the Vajrayana is the final stage, that's why I call it postgraduate. So Mahamudra is a sutra teaching, but it's got the tantric aspect of it as well. So it's always given in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition in the context of, say, giving, like I said, highest yoga tantra empowerment. And therefore the preliminary practices you'd need to practice before you get to that, which are the 4. So, you know, the first of all, refuge. Lama, the Guru devotion is a big one for the Tibetans. And then refuge, and then bodhicitta, and then purifying negativity. These are the 4 preliminaries. So refuge in what? Refuge in the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha, to a comprehension of that. Then, you know, the other, that's helping you get renunciation. That's the first stages. Then you go to the Mahayana component. You have to try to develop this bodhicitta, have an understanding of the bodhicitta, which is this aspiration to want to never give up benefiting sentient beings on your own path to Buddhahood, so that when you do become a Buddha, you can continue to manifest in countless bodies to benefit sentient beings. Some views in Buddhism, including the Theravada, would say, when you've achieved your own nirvana, when you've cut all the delusions completely, when you've realized emptiness, cut the root of all the delusions, cut all the delusions, the voices of ego in one life or other, once you've accomplished your nirvana, the teachings say, and this is the different Buddhist traditions, would say that when you die, you literally disappear. There is literally nothing left. Whereas the Mahayana view says your mind can never cease. Only the delusions have gone. So there's different views in Buddhist teachings, and we need to look into all of them, to understand them, study them, think about it. So the bodhicitta one is the Mahayana component, this powerful aspiration, which is based upon this powerful level of compassion, knowing on this particular sense of responsibility, they say, the bodhisattvas have, that it's my job to take away the suffering of sentient beings. So this compels you to want to be born again and again and again. Finally, you become a Buddha, and then you're effortlessly able to benefit countless sentient beings by manifesting in countless bodies effortlessly, for as long as time exists, to be of benefit to sentient beings. So this bodhicitta is crucial in the understanding of these techniques. It underpins, it's the energy that determines your wanting to do these techniques, so you can be of benefit to others. So, okay. Something Lama quotes and Lama talks about, there are 2 main methods for achieving, getting insight into the ultimate way that things exist, which means realize emptiness, which is when you cut the root of all the delusions. You cut the root of the delusions, and you realize the subtlest way that things exist. Emptiness of intrinsic existence. And so they talk. So there are 2 main methods. The one is, and this is the typical way we would all learn, using an ordinary example of the world. It's a typical way we would learn anything. If you want to go study to be a musician, like Bach, the logical approach is you learn all the theories first, isn't it? You learn the theories first, and then slowly you begin to practice on the piano until you perfect, you have the experience of that music, direct experience, isn't it? Beyond theory. That's how we learn everything. It's a very natural process. Music, math, carpentry, everything we've ever learned, you learn the theory first, and then you gradually experience the truth of it beyond the theory. That's the way of putting it, isn't it? We understand that very well. This other way, Mahamudra, and when you use music as an example, this will really show you the difficulty of it, but it sounds cute when you say it when it comes to emptiness, realizing emptiness. But the Mahamudra approach, you don't touch the theory. You go straight to the piano, no theory, and you intuit Bach. Now that shows how difficult it is, isn't it? Who could do that? I mean, who can just go to the piano and then just intuit Bach and play it directly from experience? That's intense, isn't it? So that's what Mahamudra means, but it sounds easy. I mean, as Lama says, Mahamudra is no doctrine, no dogma, no theory, just meditate. Oh, great. I don't have to learn all the boring old lamb rim. I don't have to squeeze my brain and learn about the middle way and all the theories and emptiness. Oh, good. I just meditate. Well, that's what it means when you think about the music one. Can you hear me? It's interesting. Who can just go to the piano? Nobody. It's a highly advanced person. In other words, this is the irony of it. Because the commonest one when you hear about Dzogchen or Mahamudra is beyond theory. You don't need to, you just need experience. You got to, and it's not as if we shouldn't do it. Rama says we must try. But when you understand the meaning of it, and the irony is this, if you think about it, if you did see a person, now, okay, this is a good example. I love looking on YouTube with these little children, I mean, like 4, 3, their little baby hands playing Bach. You can't believe your eyes. You think somebody photoshopped YouTube, you know? You can't believe what you're seeing. Do you understand my point? But there are these little children intuiting Bach. So and you think about it, you either think it just came out of nowhere, which means it has no cause, it's just a mystery, and that's the only way you can deduce it if you are a philosophical materialist, because a philosophical materialist does not posit a past life, do they? So you just come into this world and you can just intuit Bach. No one knows why. And it's true, if you don't posit the Buddhist view of continuity of consciousness, and if you don't posit the view of karma, which is you come into program into this life with your past habits, then there is no explanation. You get my point? There is no explanation. You can't explain it. So if you've got a Buddhist view, you know necessarily, if you see a 6-year-old playing Bach, you know, guess what? They've done it before. I mean, like rocket science. If you see anybody at the piano now, whether they're 40 or 6, if they're 40, you know they've practiced. You can deduce years of practice. But then the idea that you just come out of nowhere is really nihilistic. It's assuming there's no cause, and it's not possible for there to be anything that doesn't have a cause. So it's the same if you see, you know, I remember reading about a serial killer who will not just kill, you know, kill lots of people, but he liked to eat their brains and weird things like that. Of course, in our culture, we don't want to think about that. He's just a monster, he should go to hell. But then he analyzed what's his cause. I remember reading about him. And he said, since a little boy, he was compelled to torture the creatures and he enjoyed their pain. We don't like to hear about that. So that's why for me, the only explanation is karma. It's the only theory I can come up with. You can't blame God. I mean, we like to say God's the cause of all the good, but you can't blame God for the bad. Do you understand my point? You dare not do that if you're a Christian. God must have made me this way. Which is logical, frankly. It is logical, actually. It is logical. But we can't say that. I mean, there must be logical reasons why you can't. But I'm just thinking about my way. But if you're a Buddhist, you know, the Buddhist view of karma is so profound. And it's a view that's been around well before the Buddha. The Hindus saw karma with their subtle mind. And it's a natural law. That's the thing about the Buddha. He's not a creator. He didn't make up karma. What a joke. He's observed it with his noggin. Do you understand? And it's a natural law that necessarily anything anyone ever thinks or does or says every millisecond just naturally programs that mind in those tendencies, not to mention other things. There are different ways that karma ripens, and the most fundamental way is its habit. I mean, so if you practice a piano and you can play piano well, we can deduce logically you've become familiar with it, you've practiced it. So if you can see a person killing and they have a tendency to kill or lie or steal or be loving or kind, it's because they've practiced it. So really karma is the most simple concept. We make it mystical in the West. We don't know why that boy wants to, you know, eat someone's brains. What did his mother do to him? We have to blame the mum, isn't it? Or go back and look in his brain and go back to the monkeys. They can't find the explanations, you know. So the reason the Buddha's view theoretically is so clear. Consciousness is not physical, and we come into this life fully programmed. So what I'm getting at is if you can, you know, for example, Lamas English, one of his teachers, but also one of his disciples, is this female Lama, Khandala. I don't know what her name is. They all get the term like Khandala. I don't know what her name is. I can't forget. Got several names. But she's in Lamas Open in 2019 when I was I was the Western teacher for the Kopan course that year. And as she was there too teaching, and he announced, she's my first lady Lama, he said. I think he's got about 150 gurus. And says, my first lady Lama, he said. But she's also his disciple, so they kind of swapped the roles. It's very nice. So Rinpoche says about her that she was born as Vajrayogini, fully developed. So you either think she's come out of the sky, no cause, which is nihilistic, or guess what? She's practiced before. Hardly rocket science. So what I'm getting at is, in this life, yes, Mahamudra, you go straight to the meditation. But I would put it this way: if you're capable of intuiting Bach, you've done it before. I mean, that's why sometimes you can hear, with respect to Zen practitioners, they don't talk about karma. They don't talk about causes. It just kind of seems to come out of nowhere. You get instant enlightenment, like as if it had no cause. It just makes no sense. It's not logical, There is one moment when you can play that piece perfectly, but it's because of years and years of practice. It just didn't come from nothing. There is one moment when you will realize emptiness. The penny will drop, but that's because of years and years and years of practice. It just goes without saying. It's a dependent arising. So Mahamudra is a marvelous practice, Dzogchen. And indeed, in this life, some of us have tendency more towards experiential approach as opposed to the intellectual approach. But in the end, from life to life, you've got to have all of them, And if you are waking up in this life with more of a tendency towards experiential, it's because you've got already the theory in your brain, like Milarepa. Rinpoche talks about Milarepa. Lama talks about Milarepa. He didn't study, like the same with Kandala. Rinpoche said she came into this life fully developed as Vajrayogini. In other words, she came with all the knowledge intact, like these 6-year-olds playing Bach. One little boy, this little Russian one, I remember I've got a composer friend in Guatemala, and I played him just to hear it for a couple of minutes. He said he would say that as an advanced, mature musician playing that piano, and he was 6, this little boy, And that's my way of explaining, you understand? So Mahamudra is experiential. And so you either got the method for realizing emptiness to be, you learn the theories, you learn all the theories, just like you do with everything else, and slowly through practice, you listen. They talk about developing the wisdom of listening. We know that. You're listening, right? We're listening now. I'm listening now. Pennies can drop, can't they? Then you have the wisdom of contemplating it, go a bit deeper, thinking it through, and then you finally have the wisdom, the direct experience in proper meditation with samadhi, when it becomes experiential. There's levels and levels of these wisdoms, and we need. So there's this traditional classical approach, you listen, think about it, meditate, and one day the penny drops. You listen to the theory, you squeeze your brain, as Lama Yeshe says, and you finally can play Bach. We get it completely. That's the typical method. The other method is, as Panchen Lama talks, you go straight to the cushion. So this is how Lama talks about Mahamudra. It's an experiential method. So of course we need to do both. We must do this one. It's a very particular way of approaching it. We must do that. Now I've lost the book again. What happened to it? There we go. I'll just read you some Lama's words just so we see what he says to understand. Okay, well, here's some words of Lama. So great seal is known as the Mahamudra's the great seal, meaning that everything that exists is sealed, if you like, by its being empty. Its emptiness is the one thing that defines the existence of everything. Everything lacks intrinsic nature. Everything lacks an inherent existence by definition for the Buddha. So great seal. The word Mahamudra is used as an equivalent of the word emptiness in the teachings, So according to Tibetan Buddhism, Mahamudra is one of the most advanced teachings. Mahamudra is Sanskrit, great seal. So everything that exists is sealed by this emptiness, if you like. It establishes it as existing. So so he says the reality of non-duality. So non-duality is another term Lama uses, and it's actually broadly it's an equivalent of again the word emptiness. Is inescapable. It is the inborn nature of all phenomena. It exists equally in all things, organic, non-organic, permanent, impermanent, including all beings. It exists always within us. And they refer to it as Mahamudra. So we've got to get our head around this. That means we have to understand what the meaning of emptiness is, basically. We'll go into that. So the trouble is we totally believe in exactly the opposite of non-duality. We grasp at a dualistic me, a self-existent, real, separate me. We've been grasping at it since we were in our mother's womb. Actually, the belief in this simultaneously born, that's how they call it, ego, has been with us since beginningless time. It's beyond intellectual. Even ants and dogs have it. And as the great Mahayana scholar, Dharmakirti points out, this primordial belief in a separate me creates the concept of other. From this tremendous gap comes the evolution of all of samsara. So this idea that being a separate me is a mistake is so weird, we can't even think about it. So the implication is, you mean we're not separate really? We can't even conceive of that, because the very existence of an ego, a person in our world, is that you're a separate person by definition. But this is the Buddha's view, that when you have realized emptiness, you've cut the dualistic me, the belief in it, because it never existed. When you cut that fantasy, and you also add bodhicitta to the mix, it's literally as if you are now as big as the universe, and your me is completely encompassed by other me's. So in other words, if you have achieved these realizations, your sense of I would be as big as the universe, if you like. You'd have perfect wisdom that sees everybody else's experiences. You have this total bodhicitta that only wants to benefit them as if they were you yourself. So all we can do is use words. It's hard to conceive of this, because everybody's experience is of a very vivid, separate me. And by definition, it's miserable. We know that. So to imagine that even that is a mistake sounds pretty cosmic, you know. You can't get our head around that. So to knock out this hallucinated vision, we must realize Mahamudra, non-duality, emptiness. So the realization of Mahamudra cuts the wrong conceptions and destroys the nuclear energy of ego. This is revolutionary, more revolutionary than any political ideology. And it brings you totally beyond fear. It's the antidote to fear. Now, this is a really fascinating concept, actually. First of all, you know, we tend not to always use the word fear, but if you analyze it, we say anxious, worried, panic. They're another words for fear, basically. You know how you sometimes hear that Tara, where is she? There she is somewhere, the Buddha. There she is. Tara she destroys the fears of samsara. It's just how they talk. So that's a Buddhist way of talking about the normal state of a normal person, of anxiety and worries and fears and neuroses and jealousy and depression and anger and upset. Normal world, ordinary people. That's what they mean by the word fears. Because when you've cut the root delusion, ego grasping, which is the one that believes in the intrinsic me that's separate from you, and you therefore cut the attachment and the anger and the jealousy, all of these delusions, the afflictions, these are like, they're rooted in fear. In other words, normal, you not think you're living in fear and having a panic attack, but the normal daily worries and anxieties, they're fear. Have a look at a person who's angry. We don't think of it this way, but you think about it. If you see some kids screaming, shouting, limbs flailing, eyes full wide like saucers, tears coming out of the eyes, spit coming out of the mouth, irrational words being vomited out. Oh, he's angry. Look at him. Well, I'm sorry. He's having a serious mental breakdown, is he not? But we're so used to it, you know. If that's not riddled with fear, I don't know what's going on. Can you see my point? But we're so used to it. It's normal human behavior to have delusions. But fear is their nature. And this is the point that Lama points out when you describe even a person who's even got, like, you know, this this description of this 9 stages of achieving shamatha, even just getting to the 5th of the 9 stages, already your mind is so unfearful, which means what? Blissful, happy, joyful. This is the point that Buddha's making so simply, it's too hard for us to believe. That just naturally, as you get single-pointed concentration, because at that point, the delusions, and it's only temporary until you realize emptiness, the delusions are going to come back. But because you've subdued attachment, anger, jealousy, pride, and all the rest, what you've got left is only bliss and joy. These words are serious. Your mind is radiantly joyful. You can't imagine it. We can't imagine such states. This is what Buddha's telling us, that our natural state, to the degree that the mind is unencumbered by delusions, is joy. I mean, this is Buddha's simple point in the Four Noble Truths. The main cause of suffering is delusions. So if you remove the delusions, what have you got left? The opposite to suffering is called happiness. A nice word for happiness is joy. An even nicer one is ecstasy. An even nicer one is bliss. They're just variations of happy feelings. Buddha said this is Buddha's method for us to get happy feelings, to get happiness. It's very not complicated. We make it complicated. But this is the potential of our own mind to be joyful. Not to mention compassionate, wise, and loving. They're the virtues, and you can't get rid of them. So when they're fully developed, you are only joyful. We'll discuss all this. So when you realize emptiness, then delusions cannot come back. You can lose bodhicitta, but you can never lose the realization of emptiness because you've cut the root. If you've cut the root of something, it can't grow again. So what can't grow again is samsara, karma, negative karma, and future rebirths and suffering. You've cut that. You've cut the root cause, which is this belief in the intrinsic me, you know. So it cuts fear. When you realize emptiness, there is no fear. We should be so excited. We should be able to work day and night to get it. This is all we want anyway, is happiness. We keep thinking it comes from cakes and boyfriends. That's our problem. Keep going to the wrong cause. Okay, to answer that more technically, then I'll have to explain these 8 stages of death, and it's based upon the Vajrayana explanation of the physical and mental makeup of a person. Okay, so we've got gross consciousness inextricably linked to this gross bag of bones. So when the senses cease, that's what we normally call death, because the breath stops, the brain stops. But now your subtle, as they call it, your subtle consciousness is still there, can be, and that's inextricably linked to what they call the subtle body. When this is coming from the ancient Vajrayana, from the Hindu teachings, and it's very similar to the Chinese acupuncture ones, and this is the basis of also the Tibetan medical system. According to this model, our subtle physical energy is made up of 72,000 subtle channels, like nervous system, from top to bottom. There's a central channel that goes down just in front of your spine, and 2 side ones. And then there's all these other different spots of where there's a constriction of different channels. So the thing is, the subtle body is made up of those channels, like this nervous system, and then the wind energies, or prana they call it, that go through all those channels, coursing through all these different wind energies. And then these wind energies, and this is the Vajrayana model, quite different from the materialist one, are all inextricably linked to the different states of mind. It's not the way we think in neuroscience, that's for sure. So your Tibetan doctor, she studied for 13, 14 years all these winds, and this is the same as the Ayurvedic system, the Chinese system. And it used to be in the Western system too, the idea of winds and everything. So she'll feel your pulses, and she'll feel an imbalance of the certain winds, and she knows that's linked to your attachment, because the attachment mind is linked to its own winds, your anger is linked to the winds, all the different states of mind. And then she'll know that's why you're having panic attacks. So she'll give you she'll give you herbs that'll calm the winds down, which helps calm your attachment and your anxiety down. It's very subtle. Anyway, this is a subtler body, the subtle body. And the other one is there's also there's a liquid component. They call it kundalini. was red and white, and they initially came from the mother and the father at conception. So at conception, and you came when your mind ran to their egg and sperm like a magnet, you were in the intermediate state between lives, which is like a dream state. And then before that, you were in a previous body, not more than a few weeks before you went to your mother's womb. So when your mummy and daddy hopped into bed or wherever they hopped, you know, that's the condition that came together. And then the karma ripened for you to go to that egg and sperm. And so the second you're very subtle conscious, once the subtle conscious ceased and all these wind energies ceased, you get to very subtle consciousness. And that, so all these energies, before you leave the body, all these energies all come up to the heart chakra from all the different channels. And that's why all the extremities get cold first. And the last part to get cold is right here at the heart. So as long as your very subtle mind, it's the subtlest level of your mind, is still there, there'll be warmth there. But also there's another sign when this red and white, okay, when you go to conception, once you stop breathing, and then you're in the 3 days you might be there, then you'll leave the body eventually. And then you go to this intermediate state between lives. It's like a dream state, really. And then you're waiting for your mum and dad to hop into bed. You're waiting for your next rebirth. You've lined it all up. The karmic seed, before you even stop breathing, the karmic seed that determined that you would go to this particular mummy and daddy was already triggered, even before you stopped breathing in the past life. So you kind of booked your womb in advance, and you're waiting for mum and dad to hop into bed, right? And you're in the bardo, kind of getting impatient. When are they going to hop into bed? And that's the condition. So as soon as they hop into bed and their egg and sperm come together, you run like a magnet. Your very subtle mind will leap in there, and your very subtle mind will join a subtler level of the egg and sperm called the red and white kundalini. And then the beginning of you at that second was at your heart chakra. The chakra is in the middle of all these channels, right here. And then when you got born, got conceived, the first moment of you was your mind, the egg and the sperm and the subtle kundalini and red and white came together, and you began here. And then in the womb, you'd start to grow and all the bits and pieces would come. So death is when that leaves. So the second that splits apart, this red and white is a tiny drop there, they call, that second you finished, and you now rush off to the bardo. So anyway, just saying a few things there. So the red and the white kundalini, there's a subtler red and white energy that come from the mother and father, is what I'm saying. So another sign that your mind has left, and I couldn't see it with Jan, was when they split at the heart chakra, the white one will go down and come out the sex organ, and the red one will come out the nose. That's another indication. The other one is when you're really dead, when the mind is not there, if you press, you know how if you press here now, it'll come back. But that's shown when you press, but it doesn't come back. That means the consciousness has gone. And one of the chapters in Lama Zopa's book is called so death is what the yogis have been waiting for. So the tantric yogis, the sadhanas we do, the sadhanas when you visualize Tara and all this, they're constructed in a certain way that you combine them with the death process when you do your subtle meditation. And they've been practicing all their lives, going through these stages of ever more subtle, ever more subtle, ever more subtle. And they're waiting for death because the subtlety of the mind at death is more subtle, more easily than even the best meditator in daily life. So they're waiting for this opportunity, and they're able to go through the process of the 8 stages without losing consciousness, and they know exactly where they're going to get reborn, and they can choose it. That's when you really can choose, when you're really on the case, You understand? Yeah. I mean, this all came from the Hindus, but it's combined with the Buddhist understanding of things. But this subtle physical energy we've got is this subtle nervous system, 72,000 subtle channels, like a subtle nervous system from head to toe, and going through those channels is 2 things. Both the winds, the different wind energies. I mean, these doctors, the Tibetans and no doubt the Chinese, they studied 12, 14 years, these wind energies, all the nature of them. That's the physical prana or wind, airs. And then linked to those, inextricably linked, they talk about how the mind rides on the winds. And this is unique to the Vajrayana. That, as I said, your Tibetan doctor can feel your imbalance of, say, anger, and your imbalance of the winds that are connected to anger. And she can feel, so by giving you herbs that calm those winds down, the anger will calm down. That's how the Tibetan medical system works. So that's because the winds and the mind are inextricably linked. So and this is where even just your own practice, as Lama Zopa says, even just having positive thoughts, just thinking positive thoughts consciously thinking of compassion, that first of all develops the habit karmically for you to be more compassionate because you're training your mind, but at the same time, because that mind, that level of mind, love, is linked to its own wind. So you're purifying your wind, which in turn causes you to have good health. Okay. What time is it? Okay, so all right. So there's this technique coming from the Panchen Lama, which is coming from the lineages before. It's kept secret. He started to write about it, and it's a variation of many different. Because Holness's book, he mentions all the different variations of this type of technique in all the 4 Tibetan traditions, all coming from the Vajrayana in India. So in the Gelugpas and the Kargyupas, we call it Mahamudra, and others call it Dzogchen. Different ways of doing these meditations. They're all are methods for quickly, if you're blessed and got lots of merit, quickly realizing emptiness. So why it's so okay? So what are the unique characteristics of these 2 modes of meditation? This technique is using the same 2 modes of meditation. Shamatha and vipassana. Shamatha is concentration, and then shamatha is you use that concentrated mind to get insight into different things in the 2nd mode. So here, specifically, the insight or special insight is into the emptiness of your own mind. That's the unique characteristic of Mahamudra. So let's look at that. Let's talk a bit, I think, about theoretically about emptiness and what it means, emptiness of your mind. So in general, the Buddha teaches about how we have to realize the emptiness of self and then the emptiness of everything else, phenomena. That's how they talk. The selflessness of both self, a person, I, me, self, all these words are synonymous. And then there's the emptiness of everything else, which is called the emptiness of all other phenomena. Well, in this framework, mind is one of those. Mind is not the equivalent of self. Mind is emptiness of phenomena. But Lama didn't go too much into this because when he taught this, most of the Westerners hadn't had many teachings and it would have been too confusing. So he didn't distinguish much between the emptiness of the self and the emptiness of the mind. He didn't go into this, but let's look at this. But let's look at the word emptiness in the first place. So let's look at the I, the self. And this is where we get really confused because we hear Buddha say selfless. We hear Buddha say there's no self. And so we then think, oh, well, what do you mean self? There isn't one. So this is where we've got to get our words, at least words right, before we start to get the concepts right. So, okay, the Buddha is saying there are billions and millions of things that exist. And that whatever exists, a toilet, a peanut, a person, a hell being, a Buddha, impermanence itself, an apple, whatever we can posit as existing. And there are very specific ways to establish something as existing, even conventionally. Once you've established the conventional existence of something by labeling it and then defining it, like we said before, then we need to do the process of discovering how does it exist ultimately. So the word ultimate or final, that's the meaning. Ultimate just means final. So then one way of looking at all this is in terms of the 2 truths. There's a really good way of framing all this. So you have what they call conventional truth and then ultimate truth. Another way to put that is that everything that exists, thermos, person, shawl, glasses, an ant, whatever, a concept, anything. If it does exist, it has these 2 modes of existing, 2 ways of existing. One is its conventional character, and one is its ultimate. So initially when we hear these 2 truths, at the moment, we have what they call extreme views, but complete opposite. So the shorthand for how something exists conventionally, the shorthand is the term dependent arising or interdependence. The term for the final way that things exist, the shorthand, is the word emptiness. So everything that exists has both a conventional existence and the ultimate. So we use thermos or phone or iPad or this phenomenon here. Okay, so the terms in Buddhist philosophy, when you study Buddhist philosophy, you learn these different words that are all synonyms that refer to whatever exists. This is a massive thing for the Buddha. Why? Is because he says, because of these delusions in our mind, we are cognizing phenomena that do not exist. We're living in la-la land. We're clinging to things that don't exist. So his whole deal is to get us to be in touch with that which exists. Why? Is because clinging to fantasies is why we suffer. So first we establish thermos. What is it, mummy? Name is thermos. Give me the definition. First part tells you its conventional characteristics, flat-bottomed metal container. Second part tells you what it is, what it does, even what is its meaning. Think about that. The meaning of something is what its job is. You know, I put my hand out. What's that? That's called a handshake. What's a handshake? What's its meaning? It's called a greeting. Oh, now I get it. It's the way of saying hello, you know. Everything has to have a meaning. Now, what's interesting is we give it meaning. So thermos is a flat-bottomed metal container, one part of the definition. The second part, that keeps my tea warm. Now, in the establishing of this thermos, I should not just blindly believe my mummy. She's got to prove it to me. This is a really crucial point. She's got to prove it, because we'll believe anything we're told. We're so dumb. So she's got to put the tea in here, put the lid on, leave it for 3 hours, come back, and then open the lid and prove that her tea is kept hot. Now we've got more certainty that you don't just believe it keeps your tea warm, you know it keeps your tea warm. But even that is not enough yet. She's got to make sure there's no other definition of a same thing in this world that we exist in that contradicts that. Then we're now getting some inferential certainty, logically based on what is a thermos, you know. So now there's another phenomenon, it's called an iPad or a phone or a flower or a lid or a biscuit or cookie in America. So what's a person? We're not a biscuit. We're not a toilet. We might teach ourselves like one. The phenomenon, the type of phenomena that we are is called a person. This is a really important thing to remember, to know. So there's several synonyms. Person, I, self, me, myself. These are all terms we can use, variations that refer to this phenomenon here, that phenomenon there. You know, that's a person. So we're one of those. So what's a person? I mean, I think the definition is a pretty dumb one. I can't remember it. But the term sentient being is a good one, because a sentient being is less than a person, because a Buddha is a person, but Buddha's not a sentient being. That's how they talk. But we can effectively say a being. Being is a good word. I mean, a Buddha's a being, but is a realized being. So you could argue the word being is also another word for self or person. We're one of those. That's the type of phenomena we are conventionally. And so the word sentient being is a nice one, because it means, literally, the Tibetan is mind possessor. That's really delicious. A dog is a mind possessor. And of course, there are other realms of existence. The Buddha would say he's observed, including the Hindus and the Christians and the Muslims too. They've observed hell beings, spirits, gods, humans, a whole range of mind possessors, all experiencing the results of their own actions. We are our own creators as far as Buddha is concerned. So we're one of those. We're a person. So what Buddha is saying is this: once you've established the existence of a phenomenon, in this case a person, we then have to analyze how it exists conventionally, to analyze how it exists conventionally in order to realize how it exists ultimately. So dependent arising as Lama Yeshe puts it, is the king of logics to prove the ultimate existence, which is its emptiness of inherent existence. So emptiness is the conclusion you come to from thinking about dependent arising. So things exist, a person exists, everything that exists has these levels of dependent arising. So a person, for example, the very first level of dependent arising is that I, person, come into existence in dependence upon countless causes. Well, this is karma. Karma is an excellent example of the first level of dependent arising. And this is where we start to abide by the laws of karma and take responsibility. This is where already you're loosening the grip of ego grasping, because the usual view of ego is I'm an innocent victim. I didn't ask to get born. It's not my fault. They did it to me. God made me. Mummy made me. Someone plonked me on this planet. They didn't consult me. That's how we all feel, isn't it? That's why we suffer. Poor innocent me, unfair. That's how we feel. But once you start to apply karma, you start to grow up, you take responsibility. I am the fruit of my past actions. Not mummy, daddy, or God, whom we prefer to blame. I'm in charge. If I had this experience of happiness, I must have caused it. If I had this experience of suffering, I must have caused it. This is a profound already to loosen the grip of ego grasping by thinking about the dependent arising of causes. That's in the very first level of practice. Then the next level of practice, next level of dependent arising, more subtle, I'll go into this one now, is that I, this person, me, I, this person, this bundle of mind possessor, exists in dependence upon all the bits and pieces. So what are there's two bits and pieces, first of all. There's mind and there's body. They're the two main bits and pieces, are they not? Mind and body. So the I, or you could say Robina, because Robina is the name of this I, Robina exists in dependence upon her mind and her body. And then all the mind has got millions of parts and the body's got millions of parts. So the point here is the analysis the Buddha is telling us we have to do is we have to search among all those thousands of bits and pieces of body and mind for what we believe is there, but isn't really, we've made it up, is a particular piece, a very special piece called I. So I love the example of IKEA. You check, it's a good example. So you go to IKEA, you go up on the computer and you discover that you can buy a really nice Robina at IKEA, right? Or yourself, put your name there. So you're all excited because you see the pretty picture and you go there and they give you a bloody box, don't they, with bits and pieces. You can't believe these bits and pieces. And of course, just to build a Robina, there must be millions of bits and pieces. I mean, the table's bad enough with all the weird screws and everything. You get my point now. You get my point. You go buy this delicious table and all you get is a bunch of bits. Table the same as Robina, no difference. And you're just kind of a bit depressed first. Oh, I wanted the table. You have to build the damn thing. So listen to this piece. This is an interesting piece. We know that Mr. IKEA or Mrs. IKEA didn't just chuck in 14 legs and 3 tabletops and 5 screws and you cross your fingers. They know how to build a table. They built the table and they deconstructed it and chucked the bits in. Well, pretend it's the me. They've built the me already. And that means they have to have the exact number of parts and livers and kidneys and eyes and ears and a right amount of anger and love. There must be millions of bits, think about this, that make up this package. It's the same as a table. There's no difference. There's lots and lots of bits that are very precise that you have to put together. And like a miracle, you'll get your table. You'll get your Robina. But the problem is this. We believe with absolute certainty, no one's ever told us, this is ignorance, we believe it, the main delusion, that among all those parts, we're going to find a very, very special bit in its own envelope with a special label on it, written in gold, called I. And we keep anxiously putting the legs together, put the liver in the right place and the kidney and the nose and the eyes, but we keep waiting for this damn piece called I, because we believe there can't be a proper Robina without a piece called an I. And how do we know that? Listen to our language. I have anger. I have a nose. Let's analyze that statement, okay? Proving logically that there can't be, there doesn't need to be a separate piece called I. So let's do the analysis. I will tell you a little simple example. I will give you a statement. I have a thermos and an iPad. Can you see people on Zoom? I have a thermos and an iPad. So analyze this. How many nouns there? Well, there's 3 nouns. One is a pronoun, isn't it? There's a thermos, there's an iPad, and what's the third one? It's called I, isn't it? I made a statement and I made 3 nouns. I, number 1, phenomenon. I have a thermos, number 2, and 3, and number 3, an iPad. Now, in this analysis, it's easy to prove because the point is here, this is the logic you use. They call this, if something exists, it's either got to be one thing or more than one. You can't have it both ways. So listen, how to prove I just spoke the truth? Well, you all can speak English, and you're probably not deaf, or you can mouth read, one or the other, lips read, and you can prove that what I said was true, which means you can point out 3 separate, independent things. And what does that mean? My thermos can break. My iPad is just fine. It works fine. Robina is intact and she's fine as well, because there's no relationship between these 3. They're separate and independent, pretty easy to see. So you can prove that I spoke the truth because you can point out a thermos that is not an iPad or a Robina. You can point out a Robina that's not an iPad or a thermos. And you can point out an iPad that's not Robina or the thermos. You can do that. So you prove the truth. There are 3 separate, independent things. Independent meaning they don't depend upon each other for their existence. That's easy to prove. Now I'll make another statement. I have a nose and an ear. Now, without analysis, you can look over here where the sound came from, and you can very quickly prove it's true without analysis. It's a conventional truth. Nose, ear. And the word I refers over here, doesn't it? So you can see it's true, but we have to do the analysis because this is more nuanced, isn't it? So again, how many nouns? 3. So now first, we can point to an ear that is not a nose. And that's true because an ear to listen and a nose to breathe don't depend on the face of it. Initially, simple level, do not depend on each other. It's very clear. If my ear breaks and I become deaf, my nose is fine. Hear my point. We can say that's true. And vice versa. The nose gets cut off, my ear is happy because they're independent. Now, where is the third thing? The point is, the third thing that doesn't depend upon the ear and that doesn't depend upon the nose and indeed doesn't depend on all the other bits and pieces. So where is there an I that's independent, which is what we think is there? We're looking for it in the IKEA box. We're looking for the piece that's labeled I because we believe it's there. I have a nose. So in other words, we think the I is this owner. That's the feeling of it, isn't it? Like an owner, the boss. We feel that. Now, this is one example of how it's just ridiculous to think there is a separate I. If the nose gets hurt, we know that. The ear won't feel it. Okay, if it's catastrophic, like my poor sister, everything affects everything. But in the simple level of existence of an ear and a nose, they're different. They have different functions. So it's a bit like if the ear gets hurt, or let's say Beth says, "Oh, Robina, you have such an ugly nose." And I'll say, "How dare you insult me?" We'll say that. We'll feel like in here somewhere, I have been insulted. We think that, don't we? But if being accurate, I will say, "How dare you insult me?" And she'll say, "No, I didn't insult you, Robina. I insulted your nose. So it's a bit like if there is an eye in here, a separate piece like an ear and a nose. It's like the eye, if it is separate, which is what we think, then when the nose is insulted, the eye is going, oh, phew, I'm glad she's not insulting me. Phew, poor old nose. Or when the ear gets hurt, the nose is going, oh, I'm glad it's not me getting hurt. I sympathize a little bit with the poor ear because they're separate. I know it sounds hilarious. We've got to analyze like this. So the difference here is it's more nuanced than the first statement. There is an I, but not separate. Not separate. You can't separate them. But they're interdependent. They're different. If you give a definition of an eye and you give a definition of a nose, they are definitely different definitions. But the tricky part is you can't split off. You can split off the parts of the eye. You can split off the same with a table. Table, we say my table has 4 legs. You can see the 4 legs. Well, take them away. My table has a top. Take it away. What the hell is there left? So you can't find a separate table, but there is a table that exists interdependently. So there is an I that does exist in dependence upon a nose and an ear and the anger and the love and the kindness, but you can't split it off. It's not separate. And that's the more subtle understanding that's harder for us to hear, because we want to pin everything down and point it out. There it is. You can't do that. It's not being tricky. It sounds like being tricky. But we believe there is a separate, independent, real, solid, definite, poor little me in there that gets injured and attacked and offended every second, no one loves, and this and that, and hopeless and ugly and all the other things, you know. And the delusions, the attachment, the anger and the pride and the jealousy and the low self-esteem are all the branches of the belief in this intrinsic I. So everything is like this. Everything is existing in dependence upon that name. That's the subtlest one. So it sounds like splitting hairs, really. Like sounds like, come on, you're just being ridiculous. But they say when you realize, as Lamas Zopa says, when you realized that there isn't, never has been, and never could be, that intrinsic, separate, independent, real, pointable, findable me there. When you realize that, it's as if there's no I. But conventionally, there is an I. But then the way he puts it, but it's so subtle, it's as if it's not an I. So there's kind of really tricky putting together of these two truths, you know. So the trouble is with the wrong views in our mind, which are completely instinctive. As soon as we hear there's nothing from the side of this I here that makes it the I, we think, oh, well, there's no I. And we throw the baby out with the bathwater. We fall into the abyss of the great mistake, as Tsongkhapa says. Instinctively, we do that. That's the main major mistake on the world about the meaning of emptiness. We assume it means nothingness. It's completely mistaken. And then we hear, but there is an I. We then, so this other one, we under-exaggerate the I and we throw the baby out the bathwater. And then we hear that there is an I that does exist in dependence upon parts, labels, this and that. We then over-exaggerate it and go, oh, thank God there is an I after all. Grasp. So we're running like drunken sailors between these two extreme mistaken views. There is, so we kind of get annoyed with the Buddha. Kind of make up your mind, mate. Is there an I or isn't there? So we've got to squeeze our brains. This is the intellectual approach, hearing the theories first. So when we realize the truth of this beyond conceptual, you know, in meditation, when you finally realize it for the first time, the direct, non-conceptual insight into this truth, that there never has been, isn't, and never could be such an I that we've been clinging to since beginningless time. That's the first moment of your direct realization of just, and that second, you cut the root of all suffering, and you can't fall back after that. You can't lose that realization. And that's what we're aiming for. So Mahamudra is an approach where you sit on your cushion, you start with your shamatha, very specific, we'll go to this afternoon, and then there's a particular method where you learn to get a taste of the absence of that I, it's much more subtle. We'll start this afternoon. And of course, in Buddhist teachings, there are different interpretations of emptiness, many interpretations. One of the texts you study in the Tibetan Buddhist monastic university system coming from India is they call it Buddhist tenets. And it's all the different views. I mean, there are, like Theravada is the one remaining of 18 different sub-schools of the Vibhashika school of thinking. Then you've got the Tantric school of thinking. Then you have the Mahayana. Within the Mahayana, you have Chitta Matra. And then within that, you have two more. And then the next one, you have this one, that one. There's many levels all laid out in the text, the different interpretations of many things, in particular emptiness. And this is totally appropriate because different people have different kinds of minds, So one studies all these and looks at them and tries to understand them. This is where you squeeze your brain, So this is where, when you have an experience of something, like that little boy who can play Bach perfectly, I wonder if he can teach it yet. And that's where you need to know the words. Because if you can't, you can say I'm a meditator and it's all just experiential, but you can't teach me how to do it. How mean of you. How selfish of you. That's so rude. So we need words. It's sort of like you know how to make a cake intuitively, but if you can't tell me the recipe, you're kind of keeping it to yourself. How selfish of you. So don't just think, oh, words are only theory. Words are the means of communicating with someone else. If you tell me the theory of how to make a cake, I can then get the experience myself. And that's why the words, if you're going to have them, have to be absolutely accurate. We get that when it comes to making even just a cake. You can't just say, oh, chuck in the eggs and the milk and cross your fingers. You've got to be exact in what you're saying. So you can have the experience first, but now you've got to go backwards and put it into theory. So you can help me make a cake. That's the benefit of words. So never dismiss intellectual words. Words are the method to get to the experience, or words are the way of expressing the experience. You can't just, so the experience itself is true. The taste of the cake is inexpressible. I don't want you to tell me the taste. That's boring. It might get me excited. I want you to give me the theory of how to get that taste. That's the benefit of concepts. So don't ever dismiss, oh, it's only conceptual. Yeah, if you leave it only conceptual, you're in trouble. If you think the theory, you think the recipe is the cake, you're in trouble. So I find to be experiential, but you've got to be able to put it into words so I can get it too. Thank you. Otherwise, you're being very mean and self-centered. Oh, I can't. It's beyond experience. I can't express it. Well, bloody mind your own business and stop telling me. How rude of you. So arrogant. Keep your experience to yourself.